Alrighty, so welcome to this talk, Beyond Logical Limits Towards a Science Beyond the Blind Spot. This is very much a work in progress. It's based on my thesis proposal and some of the early stages of my research work. So it's not the polished product of the results of a completed project. And so it leans very heavily on the critical side, the groundwork that's done at the beginning of the project, and much less the constructive side, that is how Gendlin's work, Gendlin's philosophy can find a way for us to arrive at scientific knowledge beyond the blind spot. So perhaps we can revisit this in a year's time or so when that side of things becomes a lot more solid. Nevertheless, when we get started, okay, there we go. So part one, I will talk about the blind spot itself. In part two, overcoming the blind spot. And then in part three, we'll have some indications about what's going on beyond the blind spot with Gendlin's work. So let me start with a summary of the project in part one. Okay, summary of the project. Why is that not working? Okay, there we go. Alongside a growing chorus of scholars, I argue that modernity today is in the midst of an existential crisis, one that is a direct consequence of our Enlightenment-influenced worldview, a scientific worldview. Not only does our worldview set us apart from the world under scientific observation, it has also come to regard this intrinsically idealized arrangement as the fundamental nature of reality itself. At its core, therefore, lies what Frank, Gleiser, and Thompson identify as a blind spot in both the sciences and everyday life, and that is the actuality of human experience itself. Furthermore, I argue that despite the sophistication of neurocognitive theories of cognition, and the pivotal corollary is that cognition itself, the experienced human thinking by which such theories are made, remains the unexamined and presupposed epistemic basis of all scientific activity. So granting this to be the case, how can we reform the practice of science in order to overcome the blind spot and the corresponding crisis? And what would such a post-blind spot science look like? Niche metaphysical debates abound and post-blind spot trends do exist. Yet presently there's no comprehensive conception of how we may arrive at scientific knowledge beyond it. So this thesis sets out to answer some of these questions and contribute to the development of such a conception, starting with what Eugene Gendlin calls a reversal of the usual philosophical order, and that is inverting the deeply ingrained habit of subsuming the actuality of experience within theoretical frameworks. Drawing on Gendlin's corpus of work and supporting sources, I aim to show not only is it possible to conduct such a reversal, but that doing so constitutes a new empiricism, one that operates beyond the blind spot of science. Okay, so let's get started with the literal blind spot and work our way from there. As we gaze out at the world, light streams through the pupil and strikes the retina, an array of light-sensitive cells which line the back of the eye. This sparks nerve impulses that course along the optic nerve and leads to the brain. Yet, where the stem of the optic nerve meets the retina, no light-sensitive cells exist, forming a blind spot in our visual field. Still, we can reveal the blind spot through the following exercise, which I've adapted from Michel Bitbol. Okay, start by closing your right eye and take a moment to stare at the cross on the right side of the slide. After playing around to find the right distance between you and the image, you'll find that the black dot on the left side will suddenly disappear. But rather than leaving some blank void in your visual field, what you see instead is the white background of the page, as if the dot is simply not there. It's precisely this phenomenon that Frank et al. And Bitbol and others draw upon as an analogy to describe our scientific worldview, that at its core lies a blind spot to human experience. Okay, so in the blind spot, Frank et al. Say, we call the source of the meaning crisis the blind spot. At the heart of science lies something that we do not see that makes science possible. Just as the blind spot lies at the heart of our visual field and makes seeing possible, in the visual field, in the visual blind spot sits the optic nerve. In the scientific blind spot sits direct experience, that by which anything appears, shows up, or becomes available to us. So what exactly are we talking about when we refer to experience, the concrete actuality of experience, first person or first-hand experience, or sometimes, given the context, consciousness? What is it that's ignored by our scientific worldview? Okay, so most concisely, one could simply say the concrete actuality of experience is just this. Roughly speaking, all this, which is now present to you, what you are currently focused on, as well as your presently lived situation that happens to be peripheral to that. For instance, right now you are attending to this talk and dwelling on whatever sense it is making to you. But your lived situation also includes where you are at the moment. It includes the feeling of your posture right now, and perhaps also noticing it more directly now that I've pointed it out. The sights and sounds around you, and the things that have been on your mind today at the fringes of your awareness, which may soon need your attention. So while it's obvious to say that experience exists, the actuality of experience itself is the concrete and ever-present happening, something so utterly pervasive and basic that, like the proverbial fish in water, we easily pass it by as it passes us by. Yet there it is for us whenever anything is felt, meant, lived, or thought. Regardless of how often what we think or feel changes, whether we have this or that idea, word, emotion, or perception, at any moment, Genlin observes, we can pause and notice. There always is the concrete present flow of feeling. And furthermore, in simply being there, it's anything but vague. So continuing with this line of explanation, borrowing the following exercise also from Bitball. If you look past your laptop screen at the moment, perhaps like me, you'll see, among other things, a coffee table, some chairs, a bookshelf, a framed picture on the wall, all of those being material objects. Now, if you close your eyes and feel the weight of your body against your seat, feel the sensation of the air against your skin. Now conjure up some mental imagery. Recall, for instance, what you had for breakfast and where you were at the time when you were eating it. After you've done that, quickly find the answer to 12 divided by 4 in your head. Now ask yourself, what is the common factor in all these events? Clearly, the common factor is experience. To take another exercise from Bitball, in contrast to the description of concrete experience, when you look at this third-person representation of an eye and brain observing a brain, the first thing I want you to notice is that for any such third-person representation, you are outside the picture. Notice, secondly, as a picture, all such representations appear within your experience. So if I were now to pose the question to you, who at this very moment is seeing the picture of a brain that is seeing a brain? How might you answer? Like many people, perhaps some of you might answer something like, oh, it's my brain that's seeing the brain that is seeing the brain. Well, perhaps. Of course, it would be silly to deny that the brain is involved. But before any of your beliefs or thoughts about it, what you had initially is your experience of seeing. When the question was posed, who is seeing the picture of the brain that is seeing a brain? You first made an inference from your experience to answer that it was your brain. Now, here's the essential point that is missed in the blind spot of science. The fact that you first made an inference from your experience to answer that it was your brain recurs ad infinitum. That is, no matter what you point to or infer is the cause of your experience, it remains that experience is presupposed. We may now notice that if you hold the belief that ultimately it is just your brain that is seeing the brain that is seeing the brain, even that belief is a conscious experience here and now. Thus, Bitball says, at the present end of the series of visual perceptions, inferences, thoughts, and beliefs, there is an experience of perceiving, thinking, believing, but an experience in every case. Even your belief that your experience is underpinned by your brain is a present experience. So to put things bluntly, science has a major blind spot to the concrete actuality of experience, and just like any blind spot, it goes unnoticed and ignored by the blinded subject. According to Frank et al., it has precipitated a crisis not only in the sciences, but an existential crisis in modernity at large. Here, it's important to emphasize that we're talking very much on the level of worldview, a worldview born out of the Enlightenment ideals of universality, rationality, and efficiency, and established now as the guiding mythos of our age, from which the collective understanding of modernity is oriented and shaped. Most scientists will, of course, tell you that scientific findings are provisional and, in the light of new evidence, always subject to revision and change. That's a point I will return to in a later section of the presentation, and the third section. Nevertheless, today, as McGilchrist puts it, where would most of us now in the West look for truth? Surely the answer has to be science. Science, which has taken over from religion as the lodestar of our age. In an era of materialism where the speed of societal change and the fusion of peoples have made traditional cultural values problematic, science alone holds out the promise of a stable knowledge on which we can rely to build our picture of the world. Be that as it may, turning now to the corresponding crisis. From the personal to the planetary, modernity today could be described as a polarized and fragmented post-truth society in which we are alienated from nature, each other, and ourselves, the consequences of which are now evident in every aspect of human affairs. Within recent memory, we have witnessed politically compromised responses to a global pandemic, immobility in the face of a climate emergency while unprecedented environmental disasters rage across the planet, divisive breakdowns in civil discourse over seemingly intractable social issues, outbreaks of global conflict, and the steady rise of science denialism, which looks upon the authority of institutional science with growing suspicion, a tool to manipulate public opinion for nefarious policy agendas. Delivered, as it were, by the promises of science from the burden of epistemic agency, the burden of being able to think for ourselves, science has increasingly displaced us as a source of trust in our own lives. As Nadler argues in his introduction to Goethe on science, the modern relinquishment by individuals of responsibility for the perception of nature has adversely affected the way in which our whole culture interacts with the natural world. Overwhelmed by the sheer quantity, complexity, and brilliance of scientific knowledge, this interaction has become increasingly ignorant and insensitive. So it could be said that the exponential rise in expert knowledge and its assimilation with increasingly specialized domains has only served to make science coldly aloof from the affairs of everyday life, creating an ever-widening gulf between what philosopher Robert Crease calls the sequestered domain of the scientific workshop, or workshop thinking, that is, the thinking that belongs to the laboratory, and the thinking that belongs to the world we actually live in. The denialist backlash today could thus be read as a crude reactionary attempt to wrest some of that agency back from science and its assumed position of authority. As Frank et al. Argue in The Blind Spot, our scientific worldview has gotten stuck in an impossible contradiction. It casts us as an insignificant accident in the grand narratives of cosmology and evolution. Yet in its search for objective truth, it repeatedly shows us that we cannot step outside our human situation to obtain such a God's eye view of reality. And here, as you can see, I give a quick example of the kind of narrative that science regularly communicates to the broader public, that, according to physicist and public intellectual Sean Carroll, we are simply blobs of organized mud that obey impersonal underlying laws. The argument for The Blind Spot Frank et al. Put forward goes into much more detail than I can often hear, and also in my thesis I go into a lot more detail about this argument and all the attending details of it. But in essence, what it boils down to is this. Drawing from Husserl's crisis of European sciences and what Whitehead calls the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, The abstract representation of nature in the physical sciences has been covertly substituted for the real world we concretely experience, confusing the physical laws of science, which express in mathematical terms how things behave within the inherently idealized, highly controlled domain of the scientific laboratory, with the experienced actuality of the world we really inhabit. As a consequence, we have been caught up in an ever-ascending spiral of abstraction and idealization, giving pride of place to mathematical physics over experience, and thus losing sight of the concrete bodily experiences that anchor the abstractions and remain necessary for them to be meaningful. This, in a nutshell, is the blind spot phenomenon fomenting a crisis of meaning in modernity today, not only in the sciences and philosophy, but also in everyday life. Indeed, as Husserl calls it, it is the surreptitious substitution of the mathematically substructed world of idealities for the only real world, the one that is actually given through perception, that is ever experienced and experienceable, our everyday life world. This substitution was promptly passed on to Galileo's successors, the physicists of all succeeding centuries. And here Galileo's in brackets because it's part of a broader context that I also go into in my thesis, where this surreptitious substitution takes place as the Enlightenment emerges out of the Aristotelian worldview that preceded it in the Enlightenment age, the beginning of the Enlightenment age. Here, by life world, Husserl means the experiential domain of living, speaking, and acting that he describes as the pre- and extra-scientific life world, which contains within itself all actual life, including the scientific life of thought. The very same issue was identified over a century and a half earlier in the Enlightenment era by German polymath Goethe, who remarked with extraordinary prescience that it is with great misfortune that physical science sets the human observer apart from its experiments and refuses to recognize nature in anything that is not shown by its instruments. Indeed, that it even uses this as a measure of its accomplishments. In words that resonate with today's blind spot arguments, a secondary phenomenon has been placed in a superior position and an archetypal phenomenon has in an inferior one. Moreover, the secondary phenomenon itself has been turned upside down by treating what is compound as simple and what is simple as compound. In this manner, the most bizarre complications and confusions have come topsy-turvy into natural science, and science continues to suffer from them. In other words, having distinguished the archetypal phenomenon from the secondary one, the primal, directly experienced reality from the derived, abstracted explanation, not only do the physical sciences invert their importance and prioritize abstraction over the experiential, but compound the issue by casting complex abstractions as ontologically primitive, while reducing the basic fact of experience to the burgeoning edifice of its theories. In short, therefore, what all this is pointing to is a metaphysical view, which we can refer to as scientific materialism, scientific naturalism, or simply materialism, a metaphysical presumption that is now taken for granted as virtually indistinguishable from the methods of science today. But this is not something that science as an empirical method can ever show. Instead, as Frank et al. Stated, it's an optional metaphysics attached to, but separable from, the actual practice of science. As such, ex-CERN computer scientist and philosopher Kastrup argues that the essential problem arises because today many people, including scientists, routinely conflate scientific materialism's underlying metaphysical claim that objective material processes are what define reality with the epistemic aim of science's empirical methodologies to yield objective knowledge of the behavior of natural phenomena distinct from observing subjects. Thus, underlying modernity today is a metaphysical world picture that is inherently insensate and devoid of meaning, within which our actual experience has no place. As psychiatrist and neuroscientist Ian McGilchrist describes it, at the core of the contemporary world is the reductionist view that we are, nature is, the earth is nothing but a bundle of senseless particles, pointlessly, helplessly, mindlessly colliding in a predictable fashion, whose existence is purely material and whose only value is utility. Not only is it mistaken, I believe, but actively damaging, physically to the natural world and psychologically, morally, and spiritually to ourselves as part of that world. It endangers everything that we should value. This he further likens to a fragmented and hypertrophied form of left hemisphere thinking that presents in cases of schizophrenia and characterizes well the dead hand of mechanism, scientism, and bureaucracy under the shadow of which all our lives are now lived. Drawing on the very same blind spot analogy, philosopher Michel Bitbol, whose work focuses on quantum mechanics and cognition, describes the epistemic move that the blind spot has mistaken for the structure of reality, and the epistemic attitude that has subsequently been entrenched. The blindness of science to experience and, as such, subordination of the actuality of experimental situations to the invariant formalism of physical theory he describes is brought about by subtracting one's actual standpoint, present time, and the fact that lab instruments are required for observing the very large and very small. You wish to wipe out your own situation and treat it as if it were made of an invisible sheet of glass through which the things out there become known and visible to an imagined point-like gaze. By systematically stripping away everything that belongs to our human situation, we are left with a vestigial framework of formal invariance, independent from all personal, spatial, and temporal viewpoints. When it comes to the sciences of cognition, therefore, seeking to recover subjective experience from those residual abstractions obtained by systematically removing it in the first place is a rather incoherent endeavor. Furthermore, he argues, the urge to unify all physical theory under a theory of everything betrays a hidden belief that ideally, the provisional nature of scientific theory should be replaced by one absolute, self-sufficient theory such that we can dispense with any further obligation to think, that theoreticians somehow think in order to avoid thinking any longer. In other words, it betrays an epistemic attitude which pervades today's scientific discourse, that complete conceptual closure of what reality is possible. Yet, as Byers argues, in The Blind Spot, Science and the Crisis of Uncertainty, mathematical proofs may appear to be the epitome of objective certainty, the complete opposite of anything that one could call subjective, because unlike our human situations, they do not change. As such, he says, in our search for an absolute certainty, logic is often divorced from its human origins and given an independent existence above and beyond human experience. But as the deepest and most important source of mathematics, upon which rests the critical fact of scientific measurement, even numbers resist ultimate definition. All reductionist attempts to define number in terms of other concepts are naive and cannot aid us in understanding or exploring the nature of number in any way, meaning no one formulation of number is itself the definition, nor does any such formulation rule out the possibility of other definitions. Of course, there are different types of numbers that comprise mathematics, natural, real, complex, etc. But there exists no intrinsic limit to the capacity of mathematics for producing new kinds. A formal definition of number then can never fully capture what Byers calls the informal situation from which the concept is derived. In other words, the wider situational context that is inherently ungraspable and intrinsically incomplete, yet without which we would have no basis for the having of any explicitly formulated definition in the first place. Rather, he says, the act of definition structures the informal situation from which a whole universe is evoked, but a universe that can only be explored, not captured. Thus, he says, in the deepest and most profound sense, the things that make up the world cannot be defined, nor can they be understood or pinned down in any definitive way. That is the gap that has emerged in the order of things, a gap and a challenge that has the most profound implications for how we conceptualize the entire scientific enterprise. In short, the cultural project of reducing reality to our explicit conceptual formulations is an innately limited and limiting exercise. Contrary to the prevailing epistemic attitude of today's scientific worldview, which thinks in order to avoid further thinking, as Byers puts it, understanding is a process without end. All right, so on to part 2. The problem with current approaches and the core proposal that we must examine directly the relationship between experiencing and its conceptualization. Okay, so for the sake of argument, let's now just accept that something goes wrong when concrete experience is ignored. In other words, when it is subsumed within theoretical frameworks, subordinated to conceptual distinctions, or made a predicate in some logical scheme, we fall into the blind spot. Let's now assume that experience is indeed the very precondition for any such theoretical framework, logical scheme, or scientific explanation whatsoever. How do we go on? Frank et al. List a handful of post-blind spot trends, such as cubism, which is a specific theoretical approach to quantum physics, complex systems theory, embodied cognition, and biological autonomy. But one of the trends they list is of particular relevance to the epistemic task at hand. Francisco Varela's neurophenomenology, a proposal he formulated as a methodological counterpart to the paradigm of enactivism and embodied cognition, or what has been termed the experiential term in the neurocognitive sciences. Neurophenomenology was the point of focus in my MRes thesis, Breaking into the Circle, written firstly to provide a philosophical justification for the first-person experiential approach that neurophenomenology takes. But secondly, drawing largely from Eugene Gendlin's philosophical corpus, to argue that it continues to face significant philosophical impasses and to suggest a way beyond these. So from within the neurocognitive sciences, I thus identify 2 key issues that can be generalized to the scientific blind spot at large, which I take up in this thesis. So allow me to explain. To put it briefly, neurophenomenology is a research program within the neurocognitive sciences that purports to supply a methodological dissolution to Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness, or the question of how subjective experience can arise from physical processes. Since experience itself is not an object, concept, or theory of any kind, rather than proposing yet another metaphysical theory upon which experience is predicated, in the neurophenomenological approach, third-person objective frameworks are formulated on the phenomenological understanding that they are no less embedded within the social and natural world we experience as embodied people than first-person accounts. Taking its starting point from the tradition of phenomenology, neurophenomenology thus turns back to the experiential domain from which both first-person accounts and scientific generalizations arise, setting up between them an epistemic framework of mutual constraints. The argument presented in my MRes thesis focused on what is known as the explanatory gap, or the epistemic gap raised by the hard problem, which refers to the fact that no matter what level of scientific analysis one undertakes, from the electrochemical firing of neurons to the microphysical constituents involved, the concrete actuality of experience, such as the experience of tasting a strawberry, cannot be found in nor derived from physical properties. So one of the crucial takeaways from the arguments of that thesis is that any approach that presupposes objective truths are simply there, entirely independent of experience, fails to solve the hard problem because the epistemic gap is created by the very presupposition. That is to say, assuming or asserting any third-person framework as if primary is precisely what elicits the epistemic gap. Any claim it makes regarding experience, therefore, can only beg the question, because it begins with premises that mirror its conclusions. it assumes from the outset that only material processes exist, and thus concludes that experience is a material process. Rather, drawing from Gendlin, the thesis demonstrated how third-person frameworks are derived from and then work in the wider experiential order, a point alluded to before when I spoke of the definition of numbers, and one I will touch upon in the next part of the talk. This points to the first issue that can be generalized to the blind spot of science at large: how to arrive upon firm epistemic ground for a first-person experiential approach to scientific investigation, because the metaphysical and epistemic aspects of the problem are tacitly conflated in our very form of thought. Thus, although neurophenomenology is a methodological move and epistemic approach, even within its native enactivist domain, it has been argued, for instance, that it is best understood as a form of idealism, or that in contrasting first and third person standpoints, it is rather a dualistic metaphysical scheme that reinforces the epistemic gap, or that the hard problem is purely a metaphysical problem and thus requires a metaphysical solution, such that a radically enactivist answer demands a form of mind-body identity theory. Indeed, even though the enactivist paradigm at large began as a concerted break from the computational origins of cognitive science, as Chimero observes, in the end, embodied cognition is still a computational theory of mind, fully explainable, for instance, in the abstract mathematical and probabilistic terms of predictive processing and Friston's free energy principle. I won't go any further into those. I do go into much more detail in this thesis and my MRes on those things. But anyway, moving on. Speaking more broadly, as a huge number of theories of consciousness in Kuhn's extraordinary taxonomy attests, while vying in niche metaphysical debates as to what theory is true, the overwhelmingly predominant approach remains one that subordinates experience to a metaphysical theory, scientific formula, or conceptual scheme. But as I am arguing in my thesis, proposing a flash new coat of paint on the walls of the same old building will do nothing to overcome the blind spot, only challenging its foundations will. While appeals have been made to various non-materialist metaphysical theories, such as Kastrup's analytic idealism, Gough's panpsychism, or even Whitehead's philosophy of organism when it's interpreted as a metaphysical interpretation of nature, which in their own way acknowledge the fundamental role experience plays in nature, regardless of their respective compatibilities with a post-blind spot perspective. The simple subscription to one conceptual picture over another leaves the foundations intact. It cannot supply us with the requisite epistemic traction needed to open up the experiential territory for a post-blind spot science to begin. Okay, so on to the second issue. With specific regard to epistemology, while the third-person formulation of theory from the data of neurobiological observation is familiar, the reciprocal move in neurophenomenology from first-person experience to its conceptual formulation is not, particularly given the mutually irreducible epistemologies between the embodied first-person approach of phenomenology and the top-down derivation of findings from the formal invariance of third-person frameworks in the standard cognitivist approach. Whenever experiences are directly referred to, even within the social and psychological sciences, experience meanings are routinely hidden under theoretical constructs, stereotyped labels, and externally observed empirical findings, quickly losing touch with their basis in experience thinking. Relatedly, this points to a deeper issue. Gendlin points out that despite general agreement among phenomenologists as to the pre-reflective and pre-thematic character of lived experience, that is, it's not first given as independent objects or a system of discrete logical units, in their attempts to philosophically examine and describe the essential characteristics of experience, neither Husserl nor other phenomenologists can claim their distinctions and organizing parameters are themselves the structure of experience. A question thus lingers over phenomenology as to what the grounds are that warrant the validity of its philosophical explications of experience, without reverting to externally imposed criteria or theoretical constructs inadvertently or otherwise. Quite apart from the standard phenomenological approach, in the arguments presented to justify neurophenomenology's first-person approach to the science of consciousness, my MRS thesis instead applied Gendlin's experiential methodology of direct reference, a systematic and deliberate attending to the pre-logical functions of felt meaning inherent to our experience situations. To give it a full account would take a whole talk in itself. But Gendlin elaborated the philosophical approach of direct reference in his first major work, Experiencing and the Creation of Meaning, originally published in 1962. And later it became known as the technique of focusing in somatic and humanistic clinical psychology. But just to give you a sense of it, I quote, direct reference lifts out, creates, finds, synthesizes, differentiates a this, which was not a this before. Nagel's canonical "something it is like" stands incidentally as a ready and familiar example of a concept explicated from direct reference, because it is not an explanatory posit, but points beyond its own formulation to the experiencing that exceeds it whenever it is applied. While I cannot describe the direct reference method in further detail in my thesis, it will be pivotal to the formulation of a post-blind spot science, because it facilitates a move that is currently absent in all other approaches: the possibility of examining directly the relationship between experiencing and its conceptualization. In other words, despite the sophistication of neurocognitive research with its burgeoning variety of theories as to what brain or brain-like mechanisms are responsible for cognition, cognition itself, by which I mean our experienced thinking, remains the unexamined and presupposed epistemic basis of all scientific activity. As Gendlin explains, the actual human thinking by which the cognitive scientists come up with their logical models is much richer and different than the logical models alone. But they don't encounter this because they don't refer to their own ongoing thinking functions, and they don't attempt to apply their models to their actual thinking. It seems unscientific to refer directly to one's experienced thinking. Direct reference counters this by facilitating a shift in how we think, from staying only within concepts to discerning how they are generated in and from experiencing. In part 3, I'll return to say just a little bit more about that. For now, to conclude this part, although non-materialist metaphysical theories and phenomenology rightly recognize experience as the essential precondition for any scientific explanation whatsoever, the pivotal corollary so far elided in current post-blind spot trends is a systematic approach to the understanding of cognition itself. That is to say, the implicit process of concept formation that arises out of the actual activity of thinking. My thesis will argue that it is precisely this task that provides us with the epistemic basis for a new science beyond the blind spot, an empiricism that Gendlin calls not naive. Okay, so part 3, a few glimpses beyond the blind spot. What's required to get the examination off the ground, that it requires the reversal of the usual philosophical order. As we saw in part 1, the blind spot worldview entails an impossible contradiction, that science tells us our experience is merely peripheral to the natural order of things, yet we cannot step outside our human situation to achieve a God's eye vision of reality, that we are inescapably central to the reality it reveals. Indeed, the objectivist assumption that science has access to such a view is a bit like believing we can catch up to the horizon by running towards it. Excuse me. Returning then to the earlier point about the provisional nature of scientific findings, this paradox exposes a fundamental inconsistency in the blind spot worldview. While, as I mentioned earlier, scientists insist their findings are always provisional and subject to change, the unexamined conviction that their invariant frameworks capture the order of nature blinds them to the far-reaching implications of this fact. As Gentlin points out in his last major work, A Process Model, we must consider very closely that since our formulations change, neither the last set nor the next set of determinants can possibly be what actually determines nature. Yet, Gentlin argues, the continued insistence these formulations predetermine nature pretends that it has the sort of order that our formulations have. Over time, science has instead delivered a progression of formulations, each empirically predicting and harnessing aspects of nature such that it responds to them accordingly, quite exactly, and always just so. That is to say, each set of determinants yields predictable findings from nature valid within its scope. Yet, as Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions shows, this year's set is not logically deducible from the last. Nature, in other words, has a responsive sort of order that includes us and our empirical procedures. In this way, nature exhibits their progression, but not any single conceptual framework, and so it cannot possibly be equivalent to any of them. This unexamined faith in invariant frameworks thus perpetuates a cultural myth that these constructs dictate the order of nature and inexorably our future. Let us also recall Bayer's observations about the deepest and most important source of mathematics, numbers, from which arises the seductive illusion of objective control. The recognition that mathematical definitions cannot pin down the inherently ungraspable context from which they arise leads directly to the starting point of Gentlin's project, enabling us to reframe the blind spot's gap between fixed forms and the situational context from which they originate as the more than logical source of depth and ongoing possibility. As concluded in part 2, the core claim my thesis is setting out to defend. Do I have another slide for that? Yes. Is that to overcome the blind spot, we must examine directly the relationship between experiencing and its conceptualization. But what is required to get such an examination off the ground and facilitate the new kind of thinking that purports to move us beyond the blind spot? If Gentlin were asked this question, he would reply nothing less than a reversal of the usual philosophical order. What this means is that philosophy is long overdue for another Copernican revolution. One, says Gentlin, that recognizes felt experiencing not merely as revolving around the requirements of logical constructs, but crucially as the center of consideration in its own right. Through such a reversal, we can thereby open up the experiential territory that is implicitly involved in the formulation of knowledge, a territory that is not merely vague, ineffable, or some kind of unconscious background, but more precise than any explicit conceptual formulation alone. A demanding precision that is always at work in the formulation of new and ever more precise scientific concepts. However, it is a territory that still remains largely terra incognita. Entering this realm requires us to abandon the entrenched assumptions tied to the blind spot worldview, which subsume experience under its edifice of theoretical constructs. That is, an approach that shifts us from the usual procedure that first asserts some logical formula, theoretical framework, or metaphysical scheme, to which the concrete fact of experiencing is somehow superadded, to one that makes experiencing the philosophical locus of concern, demonstrating that in any case, the actuality of experience is that from which all conceptual frameworks are in fact derived. In a manner akin to James's radical empiricism, which neither admits into its formulations any element that is not directly experienced, nor exclude from them any element that is directly experienced, The result is a new epistemology and a new empiricism that Genlin calls not naive. Genlin's process model thus begins experientially with our whole situation, in which the lived body and environment are one event or one interaction process, meaning the environment that is reflexively identical with the organism's living process. Body and environment are one, but of course, only in certain respects. Let us carefully define them. The body is a non-representational concretion of, with its environment. But body and environment also differ in some of their characteristics and doings. That is to say, as Merleau-Ponty describes, first-hand bodily experience is the vehicle of being in the world, and having a body is, for a living creature, to be intervolved in a definite environment. By intervolve, Merleau-Ponty means that body and world are not first two discriminated objects, which only then enter into externally mediated relations, as if objects in a third-person scheme. But, as Genlin states, it is air coming into lungs and blood cells. We can view this event as air coming in or as a coming into lungs and body cells. Either way, it is one event, viewed as environment or as body. Here, we are not calling it environment because it is all around, but because it participates within the life process. And body is not just the lungs, but the lungs expanding. Air coming in and lungs expanding cannot be separate. The point is that we need not split between the lungs and air. In other words, says Genlin, each is part of one organization that includes the other. Each functions as it does only in this wider functioning organization. Crucially, for our epistemic task, he adds, the whole event is already referred to when we think only of the body or only of the environment. Thus, we get an approach that can be said to start not from discriminated objects, which first exist, then interact according to an externally imposed framework of relations, a framework which is itself not an event, but one that is interaction first, recognizing that our research situation already implies it. In this approach, we do not lose third-person frameworks. New distinctions can be generated and freshly regenerated, kept inviolate and uniform, which then function in and further organize the research situation in a self-refining process of experiential feedback. The third-person frameworks of science can thus be recovered, but always on fresh ground that lies beyond the blind spot. And there I have reached the end of my talk. So I will stop sharing my screen now.